Thank you, Dimitri, and to Dr. Birol. Also, thank you to Scott Strazik again, who preceded them. Coming up next, we have a hugely exciting session on decentralizing energy. A special thanks here to Deloitte, our platinum sponsors at the Energy Transition Programme, for their collaboration on this panel and building out of this session. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Deloitte's Global Power and Utilities leader, Stanley Porter. Stanley, over to you.
Thank you, Owen, and welcome everyone from your respective time zones. As Owen mentioned, we're very happy to be a sponsor, given the importance of the energy transition. And for those who are hopefully mostly familiar with Deloitte, the energy transition, sits at the heart of kind of what we do for our clients. But we see this as one of the biggest challenges and opportunities across our sector, power, utilities, and renewables. Helping our clients both in operations, finance, human capital, and public trust. So we have an exciting panel. Each of our panelists are going to introduce themselves, but to talk about the topic of decentralizing energy, sustainability, flexibility, and diversification. And I know this is the second or third session, but just a few data points that most are probably familiar with. When we talk about decentralizing energy, we know we've been on a 10-year run that has renewables of installed capacity going from around 8% to over 20%. And IEA estimating in 2021 an additional 10% increase of installed capacity. Looking at wind and solar PV capacity on track in 2023 to take over gas, and in 2024 to outpace coal. So with renewables and sources coming on, what does the future grid look like? What does the infrastructure look like to actually achieve our aspirations and commitments to a lower carbon future? To answer that question, we have a distinguished panel that is going to help us discuss geographic differences. We have two global power companies, one primarily based in the Americas, Iberdrola globally, and then we have Siemens, who actually plays a significant role as a manufacturer, high consumer of energy, but also innovation and technology helping us solve this issue. So we're going to have Pedro Pizarro, Sabina Erglenhagen, and Augustin Delgado introduce themselves. And then we're going to go into a couple of questions and we'll have Q&A. So Pedro, we'll start with you with introductions. Pedro?
It's great. Thanks a lot, Stanley, and great being here. So I'm CEO of Edison International, and our company has a couple platforms to it. The largest one is Southern California Edison. So we get to serve 15 million residents throughout Central and Southern California in a state that's really been at the epicenter of the clean energy transition. We also have Edison Energy, which is serving clients at the large commercial and industrial level in the US and more broadly now. So we serve 15 of the Fortune 50. We are, as I mentioned, in the US, but also in Europe, Canada, Mexico, and expanding further. And so we get two different lenses on the transition. At SCE, we're very focused on how the grid is central to helping decentralized resources, distributed resources, be a part of the solution. And so we see the path to decarbonization, one that will need to be economy-wide, but driven by the use of clean energy and storage to then electrify much of society. That will require a significant increase in electric load, which means that we'll need both central station bulk power resources and a whole lot of distributed resources. On the Edison Energy side, we're seeing how commercial and industrial customers are some of the leading adopters of these technologies for reliability, sustainability, and also for economic reasons. So looking forward to the panel here, Stanley.
Thank you, Pedro. Sabina.
Yeah, thank you. Sabine Erlinghagen, I'm the CEO of Digital Grids within Siemens. And at Digital Grids and Siemens, our mission is to accelerate and secure the energy transition. And we do that by providing world-class software. And just to give you a few stats, 70% of the world's electricity grids are planned with our software. We are the market leader in metadata management software. We are proud to have the largest installed base for grid control. Hence, we tend to say we help plan, operate, and maintain utility grids. And why that is extremely important and like the most exciting times these days is because of the rise of DERs. And you mentioned it already, Pedro. Distributed energy resources are on the rise. We expect a 7x growth over the next 10 years. And we believe that this is posing mind-boggling challenges to grid operators, especially when we go to the low voltage distribution grids, and getting those ready and the processes ready. That's our mission, to help drive that at the fastest possible way. And I'm very keen on a great discussion here. Looking forward, and handing back to Stanley.
Thank you, Sabina. Augustine.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm the Chief Innovation and Sustainability Officer for Iberdrola. Iberdrola is one of the largest renewable producers worldwide. We have a strong presence in the Iberian Peninsula, in the United Kingdom, US. We are the third largest renewable producer in the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Australia, Japan, Germany, and so forth, because we are expanding our renewable capacity worldwide, because I think that this is a big transition in which the world has is underway, and it's a big opportunity for companies like ours to really embrace it and grow. For sure, it's not only generation what is needed, it's also to deliver that energy to the customers, and networks are going to play a key role on this energy transition. We have to do it effective, both in terms of economic and in a technical way, and many of our research projects and investment projects are devoted to ensure that all this renewable energy that is being produced can be delivered in an effective way and with all the security and quality to the customers. So happy to have this discussion with my colleagues today.
All right, well, thank you. So Pedro, maybe if we can step back, decentralized energy, what does that mean? And is there geographic context, given you are in a market that is heavily engaged, but maybe start us off with a definition and perspective.
Well, that's great. It probably is helpful to make sure we all have a kind of common definition here, right? So when we think about decentralized energy, it is just that. It's really transitioning what has been traditionally a system that relied on bulk power resources using the grid to get to end-use customers, to now a system that's going to have millions of nodes with resources, whether it be rooftop solar, whether it be other forms of distributed generation behind the meter, close to the meter, along with distributed storage resources to then allow much more dispersed generation and storage and use of energy. So that's at the core of it. Our belief is that requires a strong grid to be able to share those resources. And we talk about sharing economy in the context of Uber or Airbnb, and the reality is that the power sector was the original sharing economy. And that sharing is much more important now to ensure that we are maximizing the effectiveness of capital utilization across the economy. Just to put some numbers around how large this could be, and I'll just use the California example. We've analyzed what it will take for California to meet its net zero carbon ambition by 2045. So it's signed up for 5 years earlier than the Paris Agreement. And to get there, we see California having to add a massive amount of clean energy resources. We estimate something like 80 gigawatts of additions of bulk power renewables, along with 30 gigawatts of bulk power storage, complemented by 30 gigawatts of distributed energy resources like solar, like wind, and 10 gigawatts of distributed storage, much of that behind the meter. And that, those numbers are massive. We estimate that something like between the energy resources and storage, those probably require around $175 billion of investment across the economy, another $75 billion to bolster the wire system to be able to share all of that. But that's because we expect something like a 60% increase in load statewide to drive the electrification needed to then drive decarbonization. And oh, by the way, the additional benefits it brings in terms of air quality. And just, again, to scale a bit more, that means that we see 3/4 of passenger vehicles and 70% of building water heating and space heating going electric. Not everything will be electrified easily, so we'll also need clean fuels like hydrogen for the rest. But that gives you a sense of the scale here, and then the importance of having distributed resources complementing bulk power and having a strong and intelligent grid in the middle of that. And by the way, one that is cyber secure to be able to then manage those loads and resources coming together. Just one final quick point is that this isn't just about decarbonization, but just because of the physics of electric devices, they're being so much more efficient than more traditional, fossil fuel combustion and then conversion into mechanical energy. Just from the physics side, that efficiency is going to drive affordability for customers. And so we believe that our average customer in California will be spending 1/3 less of their wallet on energy than they do today by the time that they get to 2045. So that means that this transition can not only be affordable, but it can be equitable as we think about needs across society.
Excellent. Thank you, Pedro. So, Sabina, I think we heard distributed resources is going to play a part. Are the grids tech ready? Flexibility, security, maturity, just your perspective on providing solutions to get to, Pedro's definition, your perspective from Siemens?
I think the flat out answer is they are not. And that's not my voice. That's if you ask across, especially the distribution system operators around the globe, when we talk to them, or if you look up studies and market research, there's a unanimous answer is 90% are not ready. And the interesting thing is that by conventional means, but by just copying what has been done on the high voltage level, we will not get there, or we will not get there fast enough, or we will not get there at an economic return that is somehow viable, because that would mean putting out sensors, additional sensors across so many kilometers, thousands of kilometers of electrical lines and transformer stations and whatnot. So there must be smarter ways of doing that. The power of, for instance, meter data. Meter data is a rich source of information which is completely underutilized in most cases. It's used for billing purposes, but it's not yet really used for creating transparency, for better planning, and the likes. So there's huge potential for smarter solutions, for getting the grids ready. It starts with the actual onboarding, the interconnection, the requests that come in. It starts with then the management of the grid stability, the resiliency, and it goes to the point of making the whole thing economically viable. Pedro, I love what you said. I mean, it's the physics, but it's also the economics aspects of that. And for any investor in DER, there must be a way to commercially, for that to make commercial sense. And in the best case, that's not a subsidy, but that the market. And I think what you're doing in California is a great example for those markets really functioning, and how that is driving up adoption of DER across the board. So there's that technical side of not being ready. And then there is, outside of very small geographies, also that aspect of missing markets and missing economic return possibilities for those investment in DERs to make them come onto the grid really fast.
Thank you, Sabina. Augustine, Iberdrola, the scale across the globe on this topic, and you guys have number one in wind, and so you've been in the renewable space. But with new technology and the demands that both Sabina and Pedro have talked about, business models, your perspective, do we have the right business models? Are there going to be new business models? What is your and Iberdrola's perspective on the business models or transformation needed, to get to these aspirations?
Well, the truth is that Pedro has said the traditional way in which the energy system has been working for the last years, that is generation in a centralized way, and then distribution to the customers, and then use of the customer, and this system adjusting to the demand. If the demand is high, higher production, higher cost. If the demand is low, the opposite. It's changing totally, and I think that we have to pay a closer attention to the demand side and how the demand is evolving. And when we talk about distributed energy resources, the DER, we are still sometimes thinking about the old way of doing things. So it's distributed energy resources, but only on the generation side. And I think that we have to incorporate very much into the equation the distributed energy resources in the demand side, the loads, and how the change or the shift in our energy uses from fossil fuels to electricity or hydrogen in some decades will dramatically change the whole energy system and how we are approaching to it. So why I'm saying that? Because if we believe the projections about electric mobility, more than 130 million electric vehicles in our roads in 2030 and then expanding exponentially. If we believe the way we're going to heat our homes with heat pumps, or the dramatic change in the industrial uses of energy, steel or fertilizers or even cement or whatever, we will have to incorporate the demand side response and the uses of those resources together with generation. And for that, it's going to be totally needed the intelligence in the grid. The system, the demands, the distribution system operator, the transmission system operator need to know in advance what are going to be the projections for the demand, for the electric vehicles, for the residential heat, for the industrial heat, and to provide clear signals to the customers and to the generators to adjust. But it's not anymore the generation adjusting to the demand, but it's both of them. And we are suffering, we are having that in Spain, for example, today, in which prices are set on hourly basis, and it follows the different costs of energy. And we have projections that, for example, whenever we install all the renewables that we are installing here in Spain, the cheaper prices for electricity will come when you have very cheap renewables producing. For example, in summer PV or wind during the nights and so forth. So demand will be able to adjust to these cheap prices because those new energy uses are load that can be shifted, like mobility. You can charge your car during the night at many times. You can heat your home because it has a lot of inertia and so forth. So having this smart grid that will provide efficient signals hour by hour to the customers so they can shift the loads to capture the best prices is something that is needed. And here in Spain, we have it already with time of use tariffs that can be personalized even per customer. So it's something that it will spread globally, and I think that we have to take into account.
Very good. So I'm going to come back to Augustine and Pedro with a very easy question. What does the future grid look like? But Sabina, so we heard technology's role, and we heard the requirement to be economically feasible. How do we drive down the cost or the competitive nature of the cost, globally, for these technologies that are needed in the statements that have just been made by Augustine and Pedro? Like, how are you looking at driving the cost down such that it is affordable and adaptable in the grid?
I mean, the interesting thing is, if we look at the generation assets themselves, they are at cost parity or they're better than conventional generation like coal or sometimes even gas, especially if you take away subsidies. So at that level, scale will help further to drive down costs, just economies of scale. In battery storage, I guess there's more way to go on driving down costs with technology advances, and also again with achieving scale. But I'd like to highlight one other aspect of cost here. It's the transaction costs and how difficult or easy it is as a university campus, as a hospital, as a small community to say, I want a microgrid, I want decentral energy resources on my campus. How difficult or easy is that? From planning, from financial feasibility, technical feasibility, the installation, and then the running of the system, and so the operation and the commercialization. So the transaction costs involved there and the time elapse it takes to install that is, in my view, the bigger hurdle these days than the sheer economic cost of the solar panel, because you will find a financing option. I mean, we would offer you one, but you can also shop around in the market for that. So with financing, that can be done, but those transaction costs are really in the way. So many people you need to talk to, so many different expertise that you need, that it really these days, in my view, it is still too hard to install a PV, to install to make a microgrid, to optimize that microgrid on your local campus, to connect to the market and to reap that economic benefit. So that's something that is often overlooked when we talk about the economic viability of the whole thing. It's actually not the price of the solar panel, but it's the price or the transaction cost of the whole system. And the flip side of cost then is what I said earlier, this ability to earn returns. And that's in the end a win-win situation. And Pedro and Agustin, you can comment later on, but I would think that the flexibility that all those prosumers can provide a huge benefit for both the retailers, the reliability of the grid, the stability, and there's good reasons to reimburse that or to compensate that economically, and that's done through markets, what I mentioned earlier. And there are great examples out there on those markets where it's functioning. So it's driving the cost down both on the asset itself, on the transaction cost, and bringing up the return by monetizing not only the energy, but also the flexibility of it. That will be my summary.
Thank you, Sabina. So Pedro, the very easy question of what does the grid look like in the future, and or responding to Sabina's point on a return. So to you, Pedro.
Sure, that's great. Appreciate that. And Sabina, thanks for the comments. Look, the reality is that the grid of the future is going to be much more flexible, much more interconnected, but also much more complex than the grid that we have today. And it has to be in order to transition from, again, one-way power transmissions to two-way and sharing. So let me click on a few elements in that. At Southern California Edison, the utility put out a white paper just last December called Reimagining the Grid. And it built on our prior studies that looked at what resources were needed, as I described earlier, to get to net zero. And then it asks the question, well, how do you actually configure the grid so that you can interconnect so many more central station and distributed resources and storage? And to Agustin's point, it's not just about the generation and storage side, but it's also the demand side and the junction between those two. Think about an electric vehicle. Or just a battery in the garage may well be both thought of as a generation resource and a demand resource, right? Depending on the time of day and the prices in the market. And so the Reimagining the Grid white paper looked at what kind of features do we need to be enhancing on the grid to be able to manage that physical layer, as well as, to Sabina's point, that enhancer of a marketplace, right? And so we saw a number of things that were needed. First, there's just the capacity of the grid, which needs to continue to be improved. Circuits that might have been an old 4 kV circuit will need to be 12 or 16 kV if they're going to have multiple electric vehicles and storage devices and the like, sitting on them and benefiting the rest of the grid. we're going to have a system that's going to be much more based on inverter-based, customer devices, so like solar and batteries. And so we need, more advancement on the power electronics side to make that work, but then we also need the grid being able to receive that and be able to coordinate that. And I like the word coordinate, not control, because as I think about the grid of the future, operators like ourselves, I don't think are going to be controllers, but we must be coordinators if we're going to get maximum benefit for the entire economy, for all society, by using and sharing these resources. We need just different tools for grid planning, design, and operations. We also need to be thinking about this in terms of not only overall reliability or resource adequacy, but resiliency, right? And along with that, safety. So think about a state like California, where we're seeing the impacts of climate change manifested in the form of wildfires, let alone the coming sea level rise. We've had to implement tools like public safety power shutoffs when the risk is so dire. But as we transition the grid, we need to be able to move away from that to have more resilient options that allow us to deal with the risk while still having security of supply, given that so much more of the economy will be relying on electricity. And then we need regulatory frameworks. I think Sabina's point could probably get a combination here of regulatory push and marketplace pull that provides appropriate monetization for the benefits that each device is bringing to the grid. At the same time, I will tell you, though, that some of the debates that we have today are about places where that has gotten lopsided, right? So having the right balance of incentives in a way that is not disadvantaging some of the customers on the grid. And just to be blunt about it, we have a debate that is underway in California right now around the appropriate level of subsidies, for example, for net energy metering for distributed resources like solar. And so we believe that there needs to be appropriate compensation, but it needs to be done fair. And right now we have something like a $3 billion cost shift going from non-solar to solar customers. So finding that right balance will be absolutely critical. Finally, I'll say, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, but cybersecurity is going to be a big part of the grid of the future. And the reality is that as we go from managing hundreds of devices on a network to thousands to millions, the attack surface for cybersecurity, the surface we must protect, becomes that much more larger and complex. And so I know that, pleased that the industry is dedicating so much focus to that along with our government partners, but engineering cybersecurity in from the beginning will be a critical part of this. So lots of elements to that, but, I'll leave it by anchoring back on why are we doing this? And it's multiple societal benefits. There's decarbonization, there's air quality, but again, this affordability component that I mentioned earlier that Agustin reinforced. This will, these investments we make today and over the next decade or two will open up the door to a system that ultimately is more affordable given the efficiency of electric devices.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave.
I can only make a small commercial break. I can only recommend for any of the listeners here, your white paper is excellent. So a very worthwhile read. I really enjoyed
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So Augustine, same, different on the challenge, your perspective on the future grid. You're in various markets, so you have global perspective, but your comments around what does the future grid look like and the key challenges thereof.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with the point that Pedro has reasoned about interconnection. I remember 5 years ago, a paper about the death spiral that said somehow that the customers will be self-sufficient and then they will retire from the network, and then the network would be more expensive, and then more customers would retire. And we have seen the opposite. We have seen that along with the expansion of the distributed energy resources, the solar rooftop or some others, we have seen that people doesn't want to be on their own, but they want to be more interconnected. And in fact, many regulations that allow to export the surplus of your rooftops panel production to the network provides the better battery for them. Instead of having a behind the meter battery, you can export it and be paid for the excess of energy that you are using. So what we have experienced, it is that for the whole system to work, we need more network, but not less network. And we need a network that is more intelligent and not just wires, as we have been saying before. And as I said, it will allow new ways of doing things, as what I mentioned about the time of use tariffs, but also a new way of managing the energy in the industries, in the and at home. For example, if you incorporate a car, electric car into your home, you will double your energy consumption, your electricity energy consumption. If you incorporate a heat pump, you more than double again your electricity consumption. If you incorporate a solar rooftop, you decrease by half your consumption. So now you have generation, you have loads that you can shift, and you have the network that will give you many possibilities to import, export, and to handle your energy. So what I think we have to do, it is, apart from doing this smartization of the network, do it in an efficient way. So we need to keep the electricity cost as low as possible, taking into account the generation and the network and so forth, so we can accelerate this energy transition. Now, this is a fight. It's a real fight between energy carriers. We want to have CO2-free energy carriers, but we have to commit to deliver those energy-free energy carriers, like electricity coming from renewables, at a competitive cost with the existing fossil fuels. And that's the reason why gaining scale in the networks, having more electricity going through the cables, and allowing through this cheap electricity, this energy transition will really shape a whole new energy system. And the networks, as I said, will play a key role. We can see in the future, just talking about the future a bit, we will see also technologies like high voltage direct current, but also medium voltage direct current that will help us to somehow supply what we expect to be much more need for power to different customers in cities, for example, and so forth. So I think it's something that is being already done, and we will see more of that in the future. We are seeing also more transmission links in different countries, the Western link in the UK, the Eastern link, the connection between Norway and UK, the connection between France and Spain, the connection between Canada and US, and so forth. We are going to see more of that, trying to bring cheap renewable cost to the consumption centers. And overall, I think that the whole system, the companies dealing with distribution and transmission will see a very big investment cycle.
Good. So we have questions rolling in. I have like one last question for you guys on your bet on what technology will close the gap for utilities, power utilities. But a couple of questions, and anyone can take it. What is the role of gas and hydrogen? Does natural gas play? Just maybe a quick, somebody take that one, because I have a couple of more. And Sabina, one coming to you on technology and data. So Pedro, Agustin?
I'll give you a quick take, Stanley. Just from our analysis for California, we're also seeing this in the analysis that the Electric Power Research Institute is doing at a national level. Gas continues to be a bridge fuel. I don't think you can pull the plug on it overnight. Even in California, in our analysis, we see that there's a role for a little bit of gas, even when we get to net zero, right? Because coupled with carbon capture, it can provide flexibility and economics. Hydrogen we see as an increasingly important fuel. And again, the Electric Power Research Institute is doing a 5-year project right now with the Gas Technology Institute, looking at low carbon resources like hydrogen and what role they can play, and really getting into the technical aspects of it. In our analysis, we saw hydrogen, as long as it's clean hydrogen, right, not from methanation, but from electrolysis, playing an important role in hard to electrify applications in the economy. So, important roles for those to complement and kind of fill in the holes where electrification might have some limits.
Augustine?
If we look at the picture of the energy matrix that we have in the world today, around 20, 23, 25% of the energy is supplied with electricity. The rest is supplied with fossil fuels. We are so far to achieve this net zero that I agree with Pedro that gas is going to, you cannot remove gas from the equation in just one night. Having said so, what I wanted to point is that natural gas or oil are decreasing energy carriers. And you have to take that into account before making any investment in infrastructure, because you can have a stranded asset in the future. So if you want to have a net zero for 2050, if you are going to invest in 2020 in a gas infrastructure, you have to take that into account, because you only will have 30 years for appreciation of the assets. So what I want to say is that although you need gas and they will play a role and so on, they are decreasing energy carriers. Electricity will have to overtake from 25%, 23% of the energy consumption, final energy consumption today, to 70% or 80%. And we are seeing two different worlds. The world of investment, the world of new technologies, the world of new uses of energy that comes from electricity. And we are seeing a world that is going to remain as a backup solution for niche applications and so on, that is fossil fuels. And this is going to happen in 30 years. And it's going to start happening in this decade very much. So yeah, it's going to play a role, but be careful with this role, because it's a very, very big decreasing role, and I would take that into account.
Thank you.
Just give you a quick number for California: 50% decline in gas is what we see, and 40% of that coming from biogas. So I totally agree.
Yeah. So Sabina, maybe a couple questions here combined. Energy efficiency plays a huge role in this equation. Thoughts on improving the use of data for predictability, analysis, prescriptive analysis for load, curve, and assets?
Wow. This is a large one. Where do I start? I mean, let's start from the very, very big picture. I mean, we just said how difficult it is to do that transition, to have kind of coal on the decline, gas as well, sharp declining. At the same time, we are seeing electrification, and we are seeing a doubling of electricity consumption in the upcoming years. So that said, every percentage point of that electricity consumption to go down makes the problem of that transition smaller. So we need, there's no way we can only say we transition to green electricity. We have to look at the consumption side as well. And I think that's, Augustine, what you also said multiple times. So like bringing down consumption is of utmost importance. Buildings play a huge role here, and one might underestimate that because one might think, well, it's just the lights on, but the potential, the portion of buildings in the power consumption piece is huge, and the efficiency gains that are still to be had are huge as well, because I mean, there's 1% of the built stock that is renewed every year. So there's 99% of existing buildings that need energy efficiency measures to bring that down. And especially in geographies which are on the rise, where you have a lot of cooling. So it's not only the lights, it's especially the cooling, where getting to carbon neutrality for our buildings is a huge one. And data plays a massive role. I was just, when we had the pre-chat, we were thinking about coming back to the office and smart strategies around that. So having user-centric buildings that are economically viable, that are carbon neutral, that are user-centric, so great places to work, to cure, to educate, And then great healthy places in the pandemic times is a huge challenge, and only with data we can tackle that one. And that's all behind the meter, of course. When you then get to microgrids and to optimizing what we've just talked before, I mean, I think it was Pedro saying a battery can be a consumer or a producer, right? So, but what is the right, like, when is the right timing for producing and when is the right timing for consuming? That's what data is telling us. And that's why you need to bring together the different demands of how you can trade in markets, what's the best for your energy efficiency, for your CO2 profile and the likes. So there's at what we call the grid edge, so the building side, the ends of the grid, there's a mind-boggling number of data sources that you could take into account, weather data and the likes, to optimize your local microgrid or your local installation. And then the other piece of data is obviously, and Agustin and Pedro can talk much more sophisticated about that one, is how to keep grids resilient, especially on the low voltage side, given that new normal, if we want to say so, with DERs out there. Then again, I mean, human decision making gets to its limit at some point in time. So a grid operator in the control room, consuming all those data points and taking the right decision at any given point in time is challenging today, but might get beyond challenging at that point. And then you need what we would call assisted or semi-autonomous ways of running and managing the grids. And again, data, I mean, we can't underestimate what that can do for us. And luckily enough, I mean, some of the data is already there these days with metering rolled out in many places these days. There's a few countries where we're still in the progress, but in a lot of countries we're second, third wave of metering and thinking about those use cases that were on the horizon for a long time. So I think closing this off, there was a question the other day to me, is this continuing to go gradual, or are we at a point where it's turning into sudden? And I think this data question and the complexity question is one which goes from gradual to sudden almost as we speak.
Very good. So I'll be mindful of time to maybe hit some quite big questions that are coming in kind of with your closing comments combined. What technologies hold the greatest impact and potential to close the gap? Sabina mentioned, I asked the question, are we there yet? But, technology, commercialized technology on the sources or on the grid side, there is still a gap to get to our aspirations. And so what technologies and or investments will have the biggest impact to our collective aspirations? And so we'll just go through and we'll start with you, Pedro.
Well, I'll do the 30-second lightning round on this. Take all of the above. And so it'll be technologies on the grid side that we've talked some about, strengthening the grid, making it more, helping with in terms of climate adaptation, but importantly, the sensing technology and the computational capacity to drive that grid intelligence in a cybersecure way. On the resources side, everything from continuing to go up the curve with renewables to particularly in storage. As a former chemist, I'm really focused on the chemistries that take us beyond lithium-ion. And so, great to see the work that's going on at Argonne National Lab, where I'm on the board, and through DOE and globally on that. And then finally, I'll say just a whole slew of technologies on the consumer or end user side. So we're actually making a number of portfolio investments in companies, whether it be in the electrification space, the consumer space, that will help drive the efficient use of electricity to decarbonize, improve air quality, and to capture economics for customers.
Thank you. Great closing comments. Agustin.
Yeah, well, I want to say that we have today the technology to really start this transition and to make it meaningful. So we have solar, we have wind, we have batteries that are going to improve for changing mobility. We have heat pumps. We have the technology for the networks, for the smartization of the networks and so on. So as you can see in the investment energy outlook of the International Energy Agency, it's a matter right now of developing technology for sure, but it's a matter of investment in this energy transition, and this is happening already. So we can capture the low-hanging fruit, and this low-hanging fruit is a lot, and it's happening in this decade, and mainly in the generation side and the transmission distribution side, and it's going to start happening also in the demand side. So we have already a technology at our hand, and this is something that is not relying on a moonshot, on discovering the Coca-Cola secret or the Pepsi-Cola secret. Doesn't matter. We have the technology already.
Very good. Thank you. Sabina.
I would say it's not so much about technology, it's more about the speed of implementation. And the power of DERs is that it's a lot of independent decisions by a lot of people. And if you think about how fast smartphones came about, it was a lot of independent people taking the decision to take a smartphone. So if a lot of people or companies, enterprises take independent decisions to go microgrid, to go renewables on their sites, on their campuses, then I think we can generate the speed that we need to accelerate the energy transition to the levels needed.
Well, Sabina, Agustin, Pedro, thank you so much for your time and insight. Really appreciate it. Based on the questions, I think you sparked some interest and answered some questions. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to our producers, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stanley, and thank you to our panelists as well for that fantastic session. There's more